Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to RootsTech Connect 2021 and welcome to this class on getting started in South African research. Now, I think that there are two things that we need to do before we jump into research in a new area. The first thing is know your location, and the second thing is know your records. Now, why do I say that? I see a lot of people jumping into researching their South African ancestors. They're very excited to find that they have someone who was born in South Africa or who went to South Africa over the years, and they jump right into a search engine and put in a name and get really frustrated when they don't get a result. And I think this is because you're researching without a little bit of background. It's really important you know your location and you know the records. Now, part of knowing your location is obviously to look at a map. And genealogists, we love maps. So look at historical maps of South Africa. Compare them to a modern day map. Have a look at how the boundaries changed. South Africa has experienced a lot of change in the last few decades. Provincial boundaries have changed, and that means that we need to understand that. Why? Because, well, that's going to affect where the records are held. In South Africa, genealogy records are kept on the local level. On the left is a map of South Africa as it was in 1910. This was at the time of the Union of South Africa, and so we have our 4 original provinces there. But by 1994, some changes were made. Some of those provinces were divided, and the result was 9 provinces. Again, it's important to know that because that affects where the archives are and where the records are held that you might be searching for. There are 6 main archive locations in South Africa, and then there is a National Archives database which can be searched online. This is more of a finding aid. It doesn't contain any original images of documents, but what you would do is use the information that you would gain from search on the National Archives database site and then take that either to the archives yourself to locate the document or ask somebody with boots on the ground in South Africa to go to the archives for you and locate that document. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that National Archives database in another one of my talks that I'll be giving, and that one is called Online Resources for South African Research. Now, as important as it is to understand the geography of the place that you're researching in, it is equally important to understand the history of the area. Remember that historical events created records. So, for example, the Boer War in South Africa created records like military service records, prisoner of war registers, medal rolls, casualty lists, concentration camp lists, things like the large-scale assisted immigration schemes, such as the 1820 settlers. Those, again, created a lot of genealogically rich material for us to sort through. So it's important to understand the events that took place in South Africa. I've included a short timeline in your handout that hopefully will give you an idea. It's just a very brief timeline of some of the historical events that created records in South Africa. Now, just a quick tip that I wanted to give you. When you're starting to research in a new area, or even when you just want to brush up on your knowledge of events or records in an area, take a look at the FamilySearch Research Wiki. This is a great place to start. Go to FamilySearch.org, click on the search menu, and then at the bottom of the drop-down screen, you'll see it says Research Wiki. Click on that, and you'll be taken to a screen which looks like the one that you see on the slide in front of you. You can either type in the box, the search box, the word South Africa, so that you can search there by place or by topic, or you can just click on the map of Africa. And you'll be taken to a page with everything that FamilySearch has for South Africa, all in one place. This is always my first step when I'm wanting to get an overview of what's available for a new location that I'm researching in. So now that you've got yourself feeling a little bit comfortable with the location that you're researching in, you've looked at maps, you understand the boundary changes, you've looked at some history and the historical events that could affect record creation, now you need to know your records. So what do I mean about that? What I mean is that you need to know what records exist for a particular location before you jump in and start searching. For example, if you are looking for an online birth certificate for someone born in South Africa, you're going to get frustrated very quickly because they don't exist online. Same thing goes for a census document. A lot of people who are used to working with census documents and tracking their family through the census in that way, I've seen those inquiries. They will look for their family on a census in South Africa and get very frustrated, not realizing that there are no census documents for South Africa. The censuses that were taken were for statistical purposes only and were then destroyed afterwards, and there's no information kept on individuals or families. So it's important to first know your records. Take a look at the description of the record collection. Does it cover the years that you're looking for? Those are important things to know so that you don't get frustrated. Now, as you're beginning research in South Africa, I think there are three main record groups that you'd want to be looking at. The first one is civil registration, and then the very important church records and probate records. So we're going to take a look at each one of those. As you can see in the table on the screen, civil registration in South Africa began at different times. The earliest are Cape marriages from about 1700. And as I mentioned, birth certificates are not accessible online. They're kept by the Department of Home Affairs. They're not accessible to the public. You can try to order a certificate from them, but you usually need to provide all the information to them. And oftentimes that's the information that we're missing. And so it can be a little frustrating at times. Civil birth registers in the archives do exist, but they likely won't be published online anytime soon. Recently, though, the Cape Archives did open those registers to the public for viewing, but as far as I know at this point, none of the other regional archives have done so. What is really fortunate for those of us researching in South Africa is that FamilySearch.org has been digitizing marriage and death certificates, and many of those are freely available online. Now, church records are probably where you're going to be spending the most time when you're researching in South Africa. They are a very valuable source of information, consisting of baptism, marriage, and some burial records, as well as church membership books. The Dutch Reformed Church was the first official church in South Africa, established about 1665. After that came the Methodist and Anglican churches as we see the British move into South Africa, and then the Catholic Church was established a few years after those. What is important to understand is that, as I mentioned before, FamilySearch has been digitizing these records, and almost every week new records come online at FamilySearch.org. Now be aware though that if you go to FamilySearch and you do a straight search, meaning you just add your names to that search box, that means you are searching their indexed record collection. FamilySearch has indexed records, and they have records that they call image-only collections. The image-only collections have not been indexed yet, so they're not searchable by name. So it means that you can still go look at them, but you would have to then be actually searching page by page through those records. So on your screen is an example of an early baptism record. It's from 1727, written in the Old Dutch, and it tells us that on the 27th of July, Johannes Arnoldus was baptized. His father was Johannes Botma and his mother Anna Maria Kleinsman. Really wonderful. We get that maiden name in there. We know as genealogists we are always on the look for those maiden names. The witnesses are given, and in South Africa, very often those witnesses are close family members like grandparents or aunts and uncles. And then we can read the names of the witnesses there: Cornelis Hempken and Katharina Kreywagen. So here's another quick tip for you. It is really important to know your ancestors' religion. It is going to direct your search in those church records. Like I mentioned, the Dutch Reformed Church was established about 1665, but don't be caught out thinking that your British ancestors wouldn't appear in these records. The Dutch Reformed Church was the only official church until about 1778. And so many British families would have had their children baptized in the church because there was no other available. So on your screen, you can see an example of an original 1879 marriage register. This is in the Dutch Reformed Church. In fact, it's in that beautiful church that you see on the screen there in Dordrecht, Eastern Cape. Lovely original signatures you can see for Samuel Stevens and his bride, Susan Elizabeth Hine. This is a great example of a handwritten marriage register. Church membership records, these can be very valuable, particularly in the Dutch Reformed Church, where you had to be voted into membership. So when you left an area, then you had to be voted in again in your new parish. So these membership lists can be a really good source of information on our ancestors and their movements. This example comes from a collection of membership records for the Black Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. And you can see that word highlighted in yellow, Lidmaten, which means membership. And this is the membership register for Standerton in the Transvaal in 1903. And I've enlarged the entry that we're looking at. This is for Elizabeth Muddekaan. You can see her there with the underlined with the purple line. Now she had moved to Leeuwkraal, which shows us that information in the green circle, in May of 1905. It tells us that she went to the Wesley Church, that's in the bottom green circle, so most likely the Wesleyan Church. And it also tells us on the far side of the screen there in the circle that she left zonder attestaat, which means without a certificate. Now when someone left one church, they would be given a certificate to show that they were a member in good standing, and then they would provide that to their next pastor or priest. But in this case, a little bit of extra information about Elizabeth is that she left without that particular certificate. Now these membership registers, they are online at FamilySearch, and these are really just a wonderful source for placing an ancestor in a certain place at a certain time. These make for good census substitutes because remember, we don't have census documents in South Africa. So these membership registers become really vital. A quick note about cemetery registers or burial registers in South Africa. Cemeteries can be found online. You can certainly go to places like Find a Grave or Billion Graves. But the best place that I believe, in my opinion, to locate photographs of headstones is undoubtedly through the Genealogical Society of South Africa, their virtual branch. They have a project called the Gravestone Photo and Inscription Project, which currently has about 860,000 photographs in its collection, freely available to search online. What is important to note is that until fairly recently, South Africa was a country of farmers. So many graves are rural, they are on the farms. And this project has gone out and captured many of those gravestones, which are unlikely to be found in any other place. Burial registers do exist for some places, some municipal cemeteries in South Africa. Not many of them are online, but they can be particularly helpful if no gravestone exists. You can contact the cemeteries via email, reach out to them by email or phone, and it just depends on which cemetery as to how much of a response you get. I've had some really good responses from some cemeteries, and I haven't heard back from others. It is a sad state of affairs in South Africa that so many cemeteries have been looted or destroyed, and so this project is just incredibly valuable as it goes out to try to capture as many of these gravestones as possible. It's also why those burial registers become particularly important, because they could be the only resource left when looking for an ancestor's final resting place. So I am excited to share with you what I think is probably the single most useful document that you'll find in South African research, which can be located via that National Archives database that I told you about. And you can see the names of the database there on the screen. The older database was called NAIRS. That's the National Automated Archival Information Retrieval System. So quite a mouthful, known by the acronym NARS. And NARSA, the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa, is the newer database that they are currently migrating all those documents over to. So at the moment, it's important to search both of those. Now, I wanted to give a shout out to a genealogist by the name of Matthew Bodie, who has put together this incredibly useful YouTube video on how to use NARS or NARSA together with FamilySearch to locate those original images of documents. These YouTube videos go step by step through the process. It can seem a little daunting at first, but once you've done it a few times, it really does get much easier. So take a look at Matthew Bodie's YouTube channel. He has a lot of other videos on there, all particular to South African research, really excellent, so worthwhile if you're wanting to become proficient in researching in South Africa. So let me show you an example of a death notice. You can see it there on your screen. This is the death notice for Christina Elizabeth Eberhard, and there's a picture of her. I love to put a picture with a document. It just makes it seem more real to me. This is my great-grandmother, and I've gone ahead and actually enlarged the death notice so that we can look at the incredible amount of information that can be found. So on the screen, you can see the top half of the death notice for Christina. The first thing that you'll notice is that we are given her maiden name, Christina Elizabeth Eberhard, born McIntosh. And right underneath that, we get her birthplace and nationality. She was born in Knysna in the Cape Province, and her nationality was European. Right underneath that, some wonderful information. We get her father's name, William McIntosh, and her mother, Elizabeth McIntosh, with her mother's maiden name, born schoolbred right there. We also get a little bit of information here about William and Elizabeth, that they're both deceased, and both of them lived in their lifetime in Knysna, in the Cape Province. So what this means is that they were not born in Knysna, but they lived for most of their lifetime there, and that is true. Both were born in Scotland, but lived most of their adult life in Knysna. Underneath that, we get the age of the deceased, 85 years and 10 months. So if we didn't have a birth date, we could work out an approximate birth date with that information. We get her designation of occupation, and that is a housewife, pretty standard for those days. In fact, Christina was a pretty astute businesswoman. Her and her husband separated, and she ran a shop, a store, from the front room of her home in order to provide for herself and her children. We get her ordinary place of residence, which was Knysna, and then we get some information on whether she was married, widowed, etc. Tells us that she was married, and then look at this extra information here. She was judicially separated by order of the Supreme Court, and we get the place, Cape Town, and the date. This is great information if you're going to go look for a divorce record. We get a little bit of information about her spouse, or her ex-husband in this case, that his name was George Eberhard, and that he had died previously to her. He died on the 13th of October 1922. Again, look at that information. If we're going to go and search for records on George Eberhard to try to find his death notice, we have a date of death there. We have the place of their marriage, which was Port Elizabeth, and then right underneath that, the day that Christina died, which was the 28th of September 1942, and that she died in her usual place of residence, which was Knysna. Now this is the bottom half of the death notice, where we get the information on any children. Now Christina had 8 children, and all of them are mentioned right here, and the information given for each child is really amazing. For example, first child, Clara, we get her married name. It tells us Clara Page, born Eberhard, and then we get that she was married in community of property, and we get her husband's name, Frederick Charles Page, and their address. Just great information. If a child had been deceased before the mother, in this case before Christina, her daughter Christina, married name given to us again, Kewen, was deceased, and again we get her husband, Gil Kewen, and an address. If a child had died as an infant, as in number 5 for George, he died when he was about 2 years old, that information is given too. if a child was widowed, we get that information for Jessie here, Jessie Goss, that she was widow at the time of her mother's death. And last of all, Daisy Eberhard, who had not married, and that information is given to us too. And as we move down the death notice, we get information on any property left and whether a will was left. And last of all, at the bottom here, we get the information on the informant. That's the person who provided all of this information. And in this case, it was Daisy, her youngest child, who was present at the place of death. Now, I hope you can see what pure gold these death notices can be. Now, not every person who died in South Africa would have left an estate. Some people who died without a lot of assets would probably not have an estate file. But I have seen many of these death notices and with this amount of information, so it's not overly rare to find one that's like this. We also have to remember that death notices can be, they can have some errors on them, some mistakes. It's secondary information. So in this case, Daisy was providing all this information. And I just have to give a shout out to Daisy because I went and verified all this information. And every piece of information, the names, the dates, the places, was correct. So Daisy did a really incredible job. But it is important to know that sometimes that there may be children missing or a date may be wrong on that information. Something else that is important to understand, in South Africa there are two types of death records. So this first one is this death notice, but you'll also find something called a form of information of death. Now that one is more like a death certificate. The only information that it will have are things like the place of burial and the cause of death. That information is not found on the death notice. So the death certificate or the form of information of death is much more brief. You wouldn't get all of this information that we've just looked at. So it's really great if you can get both of those records for an ancestor that you're looking at. But if you had to choose, and we really hate to choose, don't we? But I would always go for the death notice because I think you have a better chance of getting a whole lot more information that way. So today we've looked at 3 record groups, very briefly: civil registration, church records, and probates. Those are really your basic records that you would start out with, but there are other record sources available for South Africa. Some other major groups would be passenger lists, immigration records, military records, and compiled genealogies. And we didn't have time to go into all of those, but please look at your class handout. I have put links to all of that information in the class handout where you can go and find those particular records. I've also included a link to a very basic Afrikaans word list. Remember, those very early records in South Africa are written in Dutch and later in Afrikaans. So it's very helpful to be able to have a basic word list to know what the records are talking about. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that I've given you some food for thought as you start researching in South Africa, that you will think about knowing your location first and knowing your records before you just jump into a search for your ancestor. If you have any questions, I can be contacted as you see on the screen there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Just a shout out to another one of my colleagues, Linda Farrell, who is also speaking on South African research. So go and take a look for her class too. Thanks everyone.